And we will see if anyone else shows up. Thank you all for coming today. This is the last of our 9 sessions. They that endure to the end shall be saved, as they say. And I appreciate you guys sticking with me, and I hope it's been worth it. We're going to talk about Methodist distinctives today, and we've been doing that all the way through here, but we haven't really looked at Methodism as Methodism and said, what is it that we do that or think that other people don't? So I'm going to go through kind of my little list, and if anyone else has got anything else they think we ought to pile on there, then we'll do that. Methodism has an orthodoxy to it that exists within the larger orthodoxy of the Christian church. We have our articles of religion and our other doctrinal standards, and we have certain practices that are associated particularly with Methodism that we do that other people don't, or they don't do like we do. And the big one for me is the Arminian view of grace versus the Calvinist view of grace. And this doesn't sound as distinct as it used to because there's very few Orthodox Calvinists out there anymore. Very few determinists, like Abraham Lincoln was a determinist all his life. And so our view of grace is more congenial to people's ears today, but I'm not sure people understand exactly what we mean by it. You'll hear people talk about 3 kinds of grace, and well, there aren't 3 kinds of grace because there's only one kind of God. But the point is, God has the same intent toward us and the same love toward us at all times of our life. But we experience him differently at different times. And to find out that he is at work in our lives before we come to know him, and that he loves us even in our unregenerate state, is prevenient grace. And he enables us, if we choose to choose him. He restores to us enough free will to do that. And when we are restored, when we discover ourselves to be the gift of his, the recipients of his mercy, and feel new life stirring in us and so forth, we experience him as a justifying God. He's going to make it right at his cost. Make us right at his cost. And that's a whole different feeling from what it felt like, those vague nudges when we sort of felt religious and spiritual when we were younger and so forth. And then comes a time when we start to realize that we feel love toward him, which we didn't before. And we feel love toward others we didn't before. And this is also his work. And as we grow more like him in our love, we call that sanctification. And our view of sanctifying grace is different from a lot of people's. And Christian perfection does not mean that you are incapable of sinning. It just means you are too full of and busy with the love of God for him and you and others, that there is no room for a non-loving thought to get foothold to express itself. So we didn't become less human or more divine or something, but we are filled with his love, and if every motive in me is love, if there is nothing I do that is not moved from love, then I cannot or do not sin. I can screw up and I can say stupid things and I can hurt people's feelings without meaning to, and I can do all kinds of things by mistake. But it's a peculiarity of Wesleyan theology that in order for it to be a sin, you had to mean it, or you had to mean something other than love. Sin is a transgression, a willing transgression of a known law of God. So sanctifying grace is how we experience God further along after we're saved. So there's not 3 kinds of grace, but there are 3 different ways we experience that grace. And we need to pay good attention to all of those things and how God works with us at all the stages in our lives. We change, but God doesn't. The next big Methodist distinctive that I would think we ought to remind ourselves of is the old Methodist slogan, everyone can be saved, and everyone can know one is saved, and everyone can be saved to the uttermost. Once again, in Calvinism, not everybody can be saved. And in a lot of theologies, you hope you're saved, but you don't know. And certainly the idea of being saved to the uttermost, that we can start living the life of heaven in the here and now, and be basically almost done, or God's almost done with us by the time he takes us home, is what Wesley thought was the reason God raised up the Methodists, to preach this doctrine of perfect love. Jesus Christ is the elect one. We are elect because we are in him. So we have a conditional election, not an unconditional election, as in Calvinism. That doctrine of assurance, once again, is made up of two things, both the witness of the Spirit and the witness of our own spirit. And if you look at Wesley's standard sermons, he has a sermon on each of those. You can know you're saved because God will tell you you're saved, and you can learn to hear that. And you know you're saved because your own spirit recognizes what's happened to you and tells you this is for real. You know it's for real. We believe in experiential, or as Wesley would have said, experimental Christianity, that we're not simply doing what we do and God's behind an impermeable barrier. We believe that God can talk to us just like we can talk to him, that we can feel God at work in our lives, we can know the leading of God, and all those kinds of things. And there are brands of Christianity where that's pretty much in doubt, where we talk about morals and social problems and all that sort of thing, but the idea that you would feel God moving in you, is telling you what to do, is just foreign to that idea. There's an old joke, and if you're from the South, and I don't think any of us are really Southerners here, but there's an old joke that a preacher was pulling into a whistle-stop train station somewhere down south, and there was this old guy leaning back up against the wall on his chair, and the preacher called out, "Mister, do people in this town enjoy their religion?" Meaning have the full exercise of it. But the old guy barely looked up from under the brim of his hat and says, "Them what has it do." We enjoy our religion. That doesn't mean we're having fun in it. It means we have the full possession of it and it's a real experience with us. We're not simply addressing ourselves to a God otherwise unknown. So those are the key Methodist doctrines, I think. Our view of grace and our view of salvation and our view of Christian life. Church life, there's another basket of things that are uniquely Methodist. First of that is the conference. And remember, at first there was only one conference. General Conference was invented in 1808 when American Methodism got too big to get everyone together in one meeting every year. And they created a delegated General Conference, and the annual conference became a different kind of thing. And there were multiple annual conferences instead of just one. So, but the conference as a way of doing business, as a way of relating to each other, is fundamental to Methodism. These last few years, as we've argued about things at the General Conference level, I've heard a lot of people say that we are the only conciliar Catholic church in the world. And by that they mean everybody in our United Methodist family around the world is equally a member and equally represented at General Conference. And General Conference is the only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church. This is not only different because all of our overseas members are actually members and not in a sister church. They're in the same church as us. But as I explained to my friends in other denominations, Methodism doesn't work top down, and Methodism doesn't work bottom up. We are organized from the middle out, and nobody else in the world is. And trying to explain Methodist structure to people who assume that we're either hierarchical or congregational is an exercise in confusion. But that's
Even
who
to
we are.
us.
What's that?
Even to us.
Well, sometimes. I was asked in one church one time, who's in charge around here? And they wanted me to decide a contest between the trustees and the administrative council and pastor parish. Who's in charge here? And I said, well, God is, I think, at least in theory. And I tried to explain that our complicated system only works if we all work together. It's like everybody in a row, everyone sits down on each other's lap and then gets back up. That's really hard to do, and you all have to work together to do it. There's no one group or body or person that gives orders to everybody else. And that frustrates people who want there to be somebody who's in charge, whether a bishop or a congregational committee or whatever. So the conference is a unique institution, not only for its governance structure, but because the way the clergy are all members of the annual conference. That's our home church, like it or not. That's where we relate to each other as friends and brothers and sisters and colleagues and so forth, in a way that we can't really in any local church, no matter how much we're loved. We will never not be somebody's pastor there. Whereas when we're all at that annual conference, we are just who we are. And nobody's impressed by the Reverend Dr. So-and-so. Itineracy and episcopacy are big parts of who we are. And we don't need to go into the mechanics of how that works. I'm a little concerned with some of the stuff that the WCA has put out about a proposed structure for our new denomination, because it looks like all the mega pastors got together and invented a denomination for the mega pastors, with more congregational control and more say over appointments and so forth. And I don't think there's any question that our bishops have abused their powers drastically. But that doesn't mean that taking those powers away and giving them to somebody else is going to make it better. Baptists complain just as much about their church life as we do about ours. They're just organized differently. And it is part of our heritage, our distinctive, that we have bishops and we go where we're sent. And that was a big part of how we spread so rapidly across the country and around the world, because the bishop could say, I want you to go start something in that town or that county over there out on the edge of nowhere. And that circuit rider would go do that. I think our problem, go ahead.
We'd be a very different church if people had the confidence to just go do that because they were asked to.
Sure. When we all settled down in station charges, when the frontier closed, we all got protective over our positions. And clergy started to try to do all the cool stuff, which left lay people without as much to do. And lay people were perfectly capable of doing all kinds of things while the circuit rider was riding circuit.
They still are.
Well, yeah, but clergy did clergy stuff, lay people did lay stuff. And that was what
maybe that's one of the reasons why the African church, I mean, it contributes to why the African church is growing as fast as it is
Sure.
They still believe that if their bishop says, go over there and start a church, they go, okay.
Well, and during the Congolese Civil War, when Bishop Tombo said the Americans need to leave because they're not safe, we're all staying and we're all going to do ministry where we are. They all stayed, and some of them were killed.
Yeah.
But they stayed and they did their jobs. And the United Methodist Church in the Congo has immense credibility, largely because of how it conducted itself during the awfulness they all lived through.
Yeah.
And lay people did a lot of that, and clergy stuck their lives on the line, and that meant their families were stuck on the line. God help us all. Clergy families did not choose this life. but they get dragged along. But there's not a frontier anymore. And we are pathetically slow in starting new churches. So we're all settled down and we're just basically, we're playing a giant card game, and every now and the bishop says, you pick up his hand, and he picks up her hand, and she picks up his hand, and we just all change our seats at the same table. We're not starting anything, we're just trading. And that has had a deleterious effect upon all of us. I don't have an answer to that. I just know that itineracy was always part of the big Methodist identity, and Episcopacy in this country as well. We talked about having sacraments, not ordinances. We've talked about lay preaching. We'll let anybody get up in a pulpit and give it a whang. The youngest person I have ever had preach in my pulpit was a 9-year-old girl because she asked to. And I said, sure, we can do that. And I went over to her house and I said, you got a Bible? Yeah, she had a picture Bible. Okay, a children's Bible. What's your favorite story? Or what do you really want to tell people is important? And she thought about that, and she kind of came up with some ideas, and I helped her refine how to put that into a talk, and she did fine. That's as much preaching as anything I can do. I've had 12-year-old senior patrol leaders preach in my pulpit on Scout Sunday, and I've had people see the video and say, you know, they were better than the bigwig we had preach at our Scout Sunday. United Methodist Temple got the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, who came from that church and that Scout troop, to come back and preach there. And I had someone from that church said, your 12-year-old did better than he did. You got to believe in people, and you got to give them a chance to see what God can do to them and with them, and that's a big part of us. We've talked about watching over each other in love, and we're trying to recover classes and bands and societies, and I think that's an important thing to do. But whether you do it that way or in some other grouping way, we Methodists have historically had as our part of our identity that we're supposed to care about how each other turns out. And we're supposed to be sensitive to each other. Go ahead.
That new book of discipline that WCA has started to put together, and they've had, what, 4 years now to work on this? And I re-downloaded it, and I'm going to go back through it again, but it would be nice if they put as much effort into lay structure and lay discipline as they put into their clergy pieces so far. And in that whole document, the biggest piece are the 3 pieces about the clergy issues. And I'm like, all you're doing is recreating the United Methodist Church here from the looks of it, except all traditionalists instead of a mixed bag.
I don't think that would be entirely a bad thing if we managed to recreate the United Methodist Church where we actually all meant what we said.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the point. I mean, that's what Art is talking about here, isn't it? Is if this new Methodism was Methodism or Methodist in its structure and its life, and instead of the laity being able to say, well, I'm just going to sit here like a lump and listen to this nice preacher talk because, I mean, he's taking classes in rhetoric and blah, 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 blah. Instead, if we're going to watch over each other in love, that means all of us watching over each other, not being busybodies, but rebuilding something like class and something like band, and holding people accountable for being part of that structure. And maybe we don't go back to getting tickets for being able to come to church and take the sacraments, but at some point, I mean, like I said last time I was in, the most powerful commercial for any of the military was the old Marine one about, you know, the few, the proud, the Marines, implying that it took special people to get in here and you were going to be very disciplined about it and so on and so forth. And one of the coolest things to watch is the Marine Silent Drill Team. And they're disciplined as all get out. And the other one is the Third Army that watches over the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And they're super disciplined. And it's a special unit. And
Well, I don't think we need to be like a military group where we're super disciplined all the time, because there has to be room for people to be weak and make mistakes. That's part of your Christian journey too. But the sense that you're part of something, this isn't just a country club that you visit on the weekends.
Yep.
We're something more than a moose lodge too. We don't just do good works and, have dinners.
Although there's nothing wrong with dinners. Now, don't go dissing dinners.
hey, we do a lot of pancake breakfasts in our area. That seems to be a thing.
I'm a big believer in food.
Well, if watching over each other in love, I've said before, Methodism is monasticism for the masses. When you join our group, you are supposed to be received as a brother or sister, and we're supposed to care about you, love you enough to correct you, and rejoice over your triumph, even if you go farther than we did.
Especially if you did.
Yeah. And so it's, I've been in some monasteries for various things, and that feels a little different from your typical church service. The way they worship together is augmented by what they mean to each other.
Maybe pastors should have more of an abbot type function.
Could be. There used to be a guy down at St. Meinrad named Brother Theodore, and he was, I think, last I heard of him, this is several years ago, he was 103. And he had special dispensation to say his daily office in Latin because that's how he learned it when he was a young man. And he never got used to saying it in English. So, but he was a permanent resident of their infirmary there. He had like a nursing home. And, he was going to be buried there with all the other monks, the way all the other monks are buried. He lived his whole life there, and that was his home in that church. And, church ought to be more like that and less like a political rally.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories about watching over one another in love, true story, I got hooked into playing Jedediah Smith at Youth 95 way back when. We were meeting at Salt Lake City, all these Methodist youth. And so Byron White, our director of scouting ministries, wanted me to play Jedediah Smith, who was the Methodist explorer who discovered Great Salt Lake. Thank you very much. And other places over there, invented the rendezvous and so forth. And so I was reading biographies of Smith in order to, get the character. And in 1827, I think, he was in the Rocky Mountains, overwintering, I think. But he sent a letter home to his brother in Ohio. And what he said was, "Oh, for a society to bear me up before a throne of grace." This is a man who was such a huge man in the development of the West that he's disappeared into myth and no one remembers him. They remember his subordinates like Jim Bridger. This is the guy who literally fought a grizzly bear and lived. The bear tore his ear off. He wore his hair long on that side for the rest of his life, but he lived. And he founded the rendezvous, and he founded the overland route to California. He did amazing things. And everyone knew, and he was as honest as could be. He was square. He was a businessman. And he was a big man in everyone's life. But the thing that he confessed about himself to his brother was he needed the prayers of other people, and he missed that little Methodist society back home where people would lift you up. And he was out here having to do Jesus all by himself on the wild and woolly, where there was no one to do it with. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a telling story about the value of that Methodist class or that Methodist society.
Yeah.
Another thing that we as Methodist distinctive is social holiness. And we don't want to let the progressives get claim to that as their exclusive property. I don't think Wesley would think much of the political argument of progressivism. But when he talked about social holiness, he meant it. This is a man who in his 80s was trooping through the snow in his leaky shoes and those tall stockings they wore in the 18th century and short breeches to beg money for the poor. Social holiness meant doing good to people's bodies as well as their souls as a practical expression of the love of God.
Mm.
And so Wesley founded clinics. He published books on home medicine. He founded a school. Interestingly, the boys who went to this school were issued small beer every day to drink, because this is England. And he said that no one should take tobacco except as prescribed by a doctor. Anyway, but Wesley fed the poor, he founded clinics, he founded schools. He was always involved in some scheme of social betterment where he would get people together to, in the civil society way that we talk about in America, to form a committee or to make something good happen, because you were supposed to do something with your life. It wasn't enough to be saved and sit on the shelf and enjoy the Sunday service and how nice the choir sounded today. You were saved to do good works. And that was how you showed what God had done in you. Even if no one ever thanked you or came to church as a response or anything else. That was social holiness. And once again, you speak of Africa. That's a big deal over there. They're still subscribing widows like they did in the New Testament. Because if you don't have any family to look after you, the church becomes your family, and we're going to see that you don't starve.
Yeah. What was this over in Malawi? One of his ministries is chlorinating water to purify it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a major part of their ministry is teaching people how to farm, providing foodstuffs to the widows and orphans, and training women in various skills so that they can make money to support themselves. And again, isn't that what we're supposed to be about?
I would like to see a lot more Methodist churches doing tutoring programs.
Yeah.
I mean, the need
ESL.
Different forms in different parts of the world. We have a lot of poor kids who do poorly in school, who need people in church to say, you know, we may not be talking about Jesus, but I'll help you whip that quadratic equation.
Well, don't push me that hard.
I can do that.
Well, I say that because I've long since forgotten how to do a quadratic equation. I knew once upon a time.
Give me a moment to remember all of the bits, and I can give you the quadratic formula and push it.
Well, you were always better at math than I was.
A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Yeah, but how do you resolve it? Okay, moving along so we don't get bogged down in that. Methodist experience has been, we talked about redemption and lift. How people who are amazingly redeemed out of the dregs of their experience, who want to give everything in their life back to God, create as a side benefit their own economic betterment. They rise in society. Now, that's not necessarily so. When Karl Marx talked about religion being the opiate of the people, he wasn't wrong. Because there are people, and I can take you to places in inner city Indianapolis where I've seen it happen, where everyone goes to church merely as a way to relieve the misery of their daily existence.
Yeah.
And it's like a big dose of laudanum that makes them feel good to get through the drudgery and the awfulness of the life they otherwise lead. And they're good people, but they're not challenging their society and their surroundings to become other than they are. They're just getting through what they're getting through. And so the application, you know, your experience, your mileage may vary. It's not an automatic that if you convert somebody, you convert their wallet and therefore their economic behavior results in this benefit, that benefit. But it should change. And Anna talked last time or time before about all the smugglers. And even in a society where everybody smuggles and nobody wants to snitch on the smugglers, Wesley said, if you're going to be a Methodist, we don't buy smuggled goods. And we don't sell them, and we don't participate. And if you sign up with us, you're going to be known in the community as someone who does not do that, and that's going to hurt. But it will ultimately change the community, and it did. Smuggling was a big thing in America too, by the way. John Hancock was one of the principal smugglers of the early American experience. Just saying.
What the Tea Party was all about.
Yes, sir.
Yay, tea parties. That's why we drink coffee.
Yes.
We talk about reaching the frontier.
Mm.
That was a big part of Methodism when we had a frontier. The two groups that did biggest guns in the Old Northwest and the Old South were the Methodists and the Baptists. And that's because Baptists didn't need anyone's permission to start a church. You got 3 Baptists, you could start a church, and probably have a second one before long.
Because they argued so much.
Whatever. Methodists, on the other hand, because of our itinerant system, the bishop could keep throwing clergy at the frontier and get out ahead of the leading edge of civilization. And the clergy would get out there, and in their preaching and teaching, they'd come around and they'd catch everybody up. They'd start a society, preach a revival, marry all the people who hadn't had a chance to get married, but they were living together, baptize their kids, and pretty soon you had a functioning town there, hacked out of the wilderness, and church was a part of that town. It wasn't No Name City like the old Paint Your Wagon musical. It wasn't just a den of iniquity. It was the people brought church along the same time they were organizing their communities. And I would list another distinctive in here, that Wesley believed, though both the Wesleys believed, in ordinary people's capacity to understand things. They never talked down to people. And they never pretended not to be Oxford educated.
Mm.
They didn't try to put on airs, after they got saved anyway. But if you read Wesley's sermons, they're full of Latin and Greek. Last time we were talking about that song, My Lord, O Love Divine, What Hast Thou Done, which ends with a quote from Ignatius of Antioch. Not that people need to know that to sing the song, but Charles Wesley was not shy about bringing in quotes from the fathers and all this very highfalutin theology and having people sing it to fix it in people's minds. You didn't have to put on airs, but we weren't going to dumb down the gospel into a popular canned version that avoided all the hard questions and all the big words. And I think you have to be able to speak with everyone at their level of communication, but you can't leave anything out.
No. And today you look at a lot of Methodist churches today, we're mostly very middle class, sometimes upper middle class congregations, which means you've got a lot of engineers and doctors and lawyers and other highly educated people, college educated at a minimum, many with advanced degrees, and they're good in their expertise area, right? But they're obviously not unintelligent and therefore are perfectly capable of understanding more advanced theological questions if you work with them on it. I mean, I've known people that lay women, who sometimes had a deeper understanding in certain areas than the pastors they had over them in some things, a more orthodox belief, if you will. So yeah, don't talk down to us.
Well, and people deserve the full load of what we've got to share, and they can take it. They can absorb it. They can know it. Not everyone's going to understand every big word. I would drop big words in my preaching like raisins in a cake. And if they was really important, I'd explain it. but sometimes I just dropped something on the way. And if it stirred people to check up on that later, that was great. But it didn't impair the overall message. But you gotta draw people up. This is how little kids learn how to read. They know most of the words. They know enough of the words to grasp what's going on, but then they meet an unfamiliar word in proper context, and they kind of know what it means before someone tells them explicitly what it means. But they keep adding new words and new concepts and new things to them. And there are some very affluent churches of all stripes where if you go in there, the preacher's just talking. I mean, it's all slogans that have been written by committee, focus groups, whatever. And you go like, I'm going to be very profound today. And they say the same thing they said last week. And it wasn't very challenging then. You know, and I just wonder, well, when do we get to the really important stuff? And I knew one fellow when I was in Terre Haute who said he was going to really stretch people today, going to preach on the Holy Trinity. And his sermon was basically incomprehensible. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And people were coming up saying, oh, that was just so profound, Reverend. Well, there are a lot of big words, so they assumed it must mean something. I think, go ahead.
Since it was just myself and Art last week, or for all the Christian arts and stuff, we didn't get into one of our favorite things to gripe about, which is praise and worship music. But one of my big issues with it is so much of it is just boring. There's not a lot there. You know, and the tunes are also boring because you're all singing the same thing, and it doesn't, you know, it sounds nice with a worship band playing along, but, you know, there's not much to do.
There's some really good worship bands. I've heard some not very good worship bands, but then I've heard some not very good choirs too.
Yeah.
You'd like our Christmas Eve program and our Easter program. 45 minutes before the actual service starts, we have a concert, because in Frederick County, about 10 miles from our church, is Shenandoah University, which started out as a Methodist conservatory.
Cool.
So we have a major music program in, you know, less than walking distance. And within our budget is always a pile of money that goes to paying some of the professors and advanced music students so that we can have these fancy concerts at Christmas and Easter. And of course, I'm sitting there going, and how many 6-year-olds are, you know, who are visiting grandma are going to sit there through this concert of classical music, often in a language they never heard before church even starts. So we're talking almost 2 hours that this whole thing is going to go on. So that's the other end of the spectrum.
I have sung the St. Matthew Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. It takes 3 hours to do because it's a Good Friday cantata. It's supposed to take 3 hours for the whole service. We had to do it over 3 chapels in seminary. Not to everyone's taste. Not within everyone's range. And last week when we were talking about music, I mentioned that for the Wesleys, the tunes were secondary. Words were what mattered. Yeah. Words carried the Methodist teaching and the Methodist experience. So, you know, I think whatever style of music you're doing is fine, but the words need to be the good words, and they need to reinforce what we're teaching otherwise. Well, that's kind of my grab bag of Methodist distinctives. Are there anything that you can think of that is distinctively Methodist, a Methodist contribution to things that you brag on us or whatever when you talk to other people?
Covered most of it.
Yeah.
I think the conference structure influences how we do church at the local level, which makes us distinctive from the Congregationalists and the other groups.
Yeah.
We're a big believer in committees, but not so that somebody can organize a pattern, but because that's how we figure out what we're doing.
Even if it takes us 3 years.
One of the things I remember as a kid that has faded away, probably because people don't do it so much in the culture, are the crafts. The United Methodist women getting together and doing bazaars and things, and all getting together certain days of the week to have quilting bees or sit around and paint. There were several churches when I was a kid that were like that we ended up at. And I don't see it so much anymore. Along the lines
we have
of,
2 circles that still do that.
it'd be neat to have, adults tutor youth. It'd be nice to have adults offering sewing classes to youth and things like that.
You would
Cooking.
love our Energizer Bunny at my church. She's been trying to get what she calls the Wonderful Wacky Wednesday program get off the ground. And part of that is we have a supper for the first half hour, 40 minutes. And then your choices are a class taught by pastor, a class taught by our lay servant, a sewing class, a knitting class, crafts for the kids. And there's she tries to get 6 or 8 different offerings in there. But of course, one of the things she most wants to do is get handbells. Because
Not
she's,
to my taste, but okay.
yeah, she's the handbell person. Hey, one of my favorite forms of music is barbershop, quartet type. I belong to a barbershop chorus for, I'm thinking about 10 years. And of course, we had competitions and so on and so forth. But we also had a lot of hymns that we shifted. Someone went through the process of rewriting them into 4-part harmony that barbershop does, which is a very close form of harmony. And it was always, unfortunately, most of the times we did that when one of our barbershoppers passed away and it was a funeral. But we also have been invited to churches to perform during a worship service. And I always enjoyed that. Of course, I also remember that as a kid growing up as a Lutheran, one of my pastors or vicar mentioned the fact that a lot of Luther's hymns were actually drinking tunes. He just put Christian words on the drinking tunes. Pretty
Why
sure
should
as
the
a
devil
German,
get all the good tunes?
Huh?
Quote, why should the devil get all the good tunes?
Yep,
General Williams,
exactly.
founder of the Salvation Army. Well, let me offer some conclusions over these 9 sessions here to finish up, and we can discuss this before we're done. One of my favorite quotes from the saints is from Saint Vincent of Lérins, who referred to what has always and everywhere and by everybody been believed. Semper ubique et omnibus. That's how you know what Orthodoxy is, what Catholicism is. Certain things are common to all Christian churches that are worthy of being called Christian churches. If they don't believe this or don't have this, they ain't one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And among the great Christian family, we can agree that Catholics and Orthodox and Baptists and Pentecostals and Methodists and Presbyterians and whatnot are all equally Christian. We're not going to say, oh, they're not good enough. Okay. They may disagree with us, but they're real Christians and they're really following Jesus and they have the same God and they say the same creed if they say creeds. And I think it helps if we think of all of the different denominations as religious orders within the Church Eternal, where we have some things that make us distinct And it doesn't mean that we think those people aren't Christian, but this is how we formulate that and how we follow that. And for Methodism, our church order goes all the way back to the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. There is such a thing as an English church tradition that you can trace back that far. A way that we have historically talked about God, things that we have been interested in that other peoples have not. For instance, the Anglo-Saxons started translating the Bible into English because they wanted the Word of God in their own language, long before anyone else in Western Europe cared about doing that. Yeah. And they cared about missions long before other peoples cared about it, and they didn't do them the same way everyone else did. Charlemagne converted the Saxons at the point of a sword, but 100 years before, the English converted the Frisians just by sending them monks.
Yeah.
So missions and the Bible and the words we use in worship, the medieval Sarum Mass is ultimately descended from the Roman rite that was brought to England in the 6th century, 7th century. When Thomas Cranmer wrote in English the prayers of our Book of Common Prayer, most of them were not original to him. He gave a Protestant spin to a few of them, but a lot of them go back to the Galatian Sacramentary, which is the 8th century in Latin. The church had been saying these words all that time. And when I was right out of seminary and I would use the prayer of consecration out of the old Methodist hymnal, I would be up there doing that. And all the ex-Catholics, former Catholics in my congregation who'd married into the Methodist Church could say it with me, because I was basically doing the medieval canon of the Mass, which Thomas Cranmer bequeathed to us, which we have continued to use. So there's a continuity there, a distinctiveness about us that's different from, say, Lutheranism, which comes out of German church culture, yeah, and the history of Christianity in Germany, and its conflicts with the Pope and so forth. Different from, other groups with other histories. And so Methodism, and then we go through the Wesleys, we have these distinct practices and teachings that define us. And without these things, Methodist is just a name. We don't have a reason for being unless it's to be Methodist. Because if I wanted to be a Baptist or a Presbyterian, there are plenty of nice Baptist and Presbyterian churches I could belong to. And if we're going to go through all of the agony of creating a new denomination because we can't get along with each other in the old one, when we're talking about all the neat ideas, I think we need to be Methodist. Isaiah 8:20 is an important verse to me, talking about people consulting the mediums and trying to come up with all of the, everyone but God, to ask what to do with the crisis of the nation. And to this, the prophet says, to the teaching and to the testimony, surely for the word which they speak, there is no dawn. And the teaching and the testimony is what we go back to. If Christianity is just what Christians do, then the progressives are right, and we're just being obstructive. Because whatever Christians do in America is just what Christians do, and that's Christianity. If, on the other hand, there's a standard to live up to, and to be judged by, and to work for, that's different. And so if we create a new denomination that is just the sum total of all the stuff we like, that we think would be better than what we've got, it hardly seems worth it to me. No. And it avoids what I think is the biggest problem we have, which is the diversity of background and opinion on the traditionalist side. Take away the progressives and their issues that we have dealt with now for 40 years. And you will find that we are not united among ourselves. And some people want us to be that kind of thing, and some of us want to be that kind of thing. And everyone wants to design their own piece of the vineyard to match their desires. And that sows the seeds of further decline and disunion if we are not going to be all on the same page when we make whatever break is coming up. And I think we got one chance to get this right. And if we don't, we're just going to be another squabbling American denomination where everybody wants to do whatever they want to do. And so the criterion is, are we going to be Methodist? And what does that mean?
Yeah.
And can we create it again? Can we find the magic again once the pressure of our current controversies are off of us? And so that's been the burden of this whole class, all 9 sessions of it. I hope I've been fair to everybody in it, and I hope I've been honest in my opinions. But I really think that some of the things that I see people wanting to do aren't Methodist enough, and it worries me deeply, because I'm at the point, it took me a long time to get there. I'm at the point where I want out of the mess we're in. And, you know, for as much as I hanker for the flesh pots of Egypt, time to go. There are times when I look at my friends in the WCA and other things, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure I want to be with you guys. We really going to organize it that way and teach it that way? And is that what we're all going to be? And maybe that's just my weirdness, and I need to get over that, get over myself. I don't know. But it bothers me. And so I think we all have to be engaged in this conversation. We have a whole extra year now to converse about it, because General Conference got put off. And we need to come up with a new answer to what does it mean to be Methodist.
Yeah. Well, I don't know so much a new answer. I mean, you know, the stuff I've read on Wesley, and I'm still learning about Wesley and how he thought, but he talked a lot about primitive church, meaning going back to the apostolic fathers, the ante-Nicene leaders and their thinking as to how to do church and be Christian. And yeah, the Moravians and the Pietists had a big impact on him, but he still was more going back to that primitive stuff. And that was my big frustration when when I did my first glance through of that document that the WCA came out with. And the first thing they flushed out was the 3 pieces about how the clergy is going to organize. And there's this little piece about the church. And that little piece about the church was basically, like you said, sloganing. There was no meat to it. And
well, I think in defense of what they're doing, there's a lot of talk about classes and bands and discipleship again. And a lot of stuff, seedbed, if not the new Cokesbury, is certainly bidding fair to become the new Cokesbury. And
I certainly put my money into it.
WCA and seedbed are kind of, feeding back and forth into each other to try to develop this idea.
Yeah.
And as Keith will tell you, that new proposed discipline ain't been finished yet. It's coming out in sections. And whenever the clergy bit came out, it was going to be a big something to argue over and look at. And, we're complicated because we're high maintenance. We clergy have all kinds of things going on. And so it's going to be a big section of the discipline, but that's not where the life of the church is.
Yeah.
We just take more rules because we're more wayward.
I think in the intro, there was like paragraph 102 or something about the laity. And I like what it said, but that was it. And of course, most people are, at best they'll skim that and then move on into the quote meat part. And I really, like I said, there really needs to be, when we have our membership pledges and do you vow, blah, 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 and we all go, yes, I do. And then what happens? One of the things you said was basically your money, your time, and your talent. And most people are perfectly content to just throw a few bucks in the plate, so it's their money, but where's their time and talent? 2 hours on Sunday, if you're lucky, that's it. less than 5% of our congregation is doing anything, and most of them have been doing it for 20 plus years. And that was one of the frustrating things when my wife and I got here, is we were so used to how involved laity was in our old church. And we came here and there's this little tiny cadre that's doing all the work. And each one's wearing like 5, 6 hats.
Sure.
I'm sorry, that isn't how it's supposed to work.
When I was on the board, or the General Commission on United Methodist Men for 4 years, and wasn't that just a little slice of heaven? I came to the conclusion that one of the problems we have is that there is no distinctively Methodist way to be a men's group. Despite having a General Commission on United Methodist Men that publishes resources and has executives working for it and so forth. If you look at the stuff they're promoting man in the mirror, iron sharpens iron, walk to Emmaus, Society of St. Andrew. There's a cluster of related programs and other people's products that they're selling. There is no distinctively United Methodist Men way to run this parade.
Yeah.
So why do we need an organization for United Methodist Men if they don't add anything to the cake? And that same problem kind of affects the whole church. Is there a distinctive way that Methodists do church as lay people, not as Sunday morning with the trained people up front and all that kind of stuff? Is there something distinctive about the Methodist people that we're teaching people and that they're following and, getting excited about? Or is it just whatever works for you and whatever works for you and whatever can gather a crowd over here?
There's no hard and fast cure for that either. One of the things I have noticed is if you put that little form out, every once in a while, church will say, what are you willing to do? What are your talents you're willing to contribute? And they may even follow up on it, but often nothing comes of it, or very little, and it's usually the same people who are eager to do stuff anyway.
Yeah.
And what you really need are a bunch of people who are willing to go around and be the leadership to turn to people and ask, do you have X? Can you show up on this day to do this thing, and make that personal? And that's not something that you can have from a program issued from Cokesbury.
Yeah.
That requires actual physical people to walk around and teach each other how to be leaders. And that's very difficult.
Because first you got to find that initial set of leaders who are willing to let go.
And they have to go out and identify people and teach, and then they have to coach people through the whole process of learning to do that with other people and so on and so forth. It's involved. And it's a volunteer organization problem all over the place. The Methodists aren't the only ones that struggle with it, but we're supposed to be better at this than we are.
Do you think part of it is we have no sense of direction, or I hate the word vision, for what it's supposed to be a Methodist layperson?
I think vision's only a bad word because how it's been abused.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, we say the words, but we don't often turn to people and act like we expect them to mean it.
Yeah.
You might get a talking to in a sermon every once in a while, once a year or twice a year. They might come up and have a series on it. But without the lay leadership to turn to you and say, you're a member of this church now, how do you want to belong? The pastor can say all the words he wants. People aren't going to get involved.
Yeah. It's like when we first came to our church and there was this program that was, I think it's a Presbyterian program called Logos, which involves getting intergenerational, having a meal together where there'd be seniors, adults, and youth or children at one table, and that same table always got together each week, right? And it was a time for fellowship, a time to talk about what's going on at school and work and so on and so forth. And then there was the crafts and other activities that went around it. And my wife and I came and we said, gee, that's a really cool idea. We'd like to be involved in that. And pastor said, well, if you want to be involved, you have to be a member of this church. And we're like, okay. And away we went. But that's how it was at the church we came from. And it's like, how come nobody in the laity asked us? You know, and you just hit it. And the last major project I worked on was one of our scouts. His Eagle project was we were going to build a retaining wall around the playground for the preschool so that we could first extend the playground area and second, level it up.
Mhm.
They call this a Shenandoah Valley, but this valley is very lumpy.
Yeah.
Very lumpy. And so we were flattening the area so that they could extend it. And there were like 7 or 8 adults and I think 2 youth that showed up, one of which was the Eagle Scout candidate.
Right.
Well, now they need to extend it again, and instead they're going to hire a contractor to take care of it. No project team, no scout, no volunteers from the church doing this stuff. And that's where we're at.
We find it very convenient to hire things done.
Yeah.
We don't ask our people to perform things. And the church that Deanne and I joined in college, at which both of our children were baptized, by the way, it's no longer a congregation, but it was a former EUB church, and it was the big EUB church in Terre Haute, Indiana, once upon a time, and it had all kinds of facilities, and you know that kind of sanctuary on a half level between the balcony and the floor and so forth. Great big thing. It had a gym and so forth. And once upon a time, it had all kinds of things going on, but they had a full-time custodian and a full-time secretary and a pastor. And they'd gotten used to hiring everything done. And as they got older and shrank, they couldn't keep it up anymore.
Yeah.
None of them knew how to do anything anymore or had the energy to do anything anymore. And they couldn't keep paying people to do all the things. They had paid pianists, paid organist. It was just huge staff for a middle-sized congregation. And so they finally just folded, because the only model they had was to pay people to do things for them.
That was one of the things
But
that
that's a
astonished
separate
us when
issue
we got
from
here.
what should they be doing? What is
Yeah.
distinctively Methodist about the way we do church?
And I think as the lay people here, Dale and I have the burden of trying to help push this stuff. I think if you wanted to have United Methodist Men to have a distinctive program, what you do is have them form up work groups and go around the shut-ins who still live in their own homes and work on their yards or fix plumbing issues in their house or whatever might be necessary to help keep them up, so they don't have to pay out of their Social Security funds for other people to do that.
And while we're at it, how about if we, instead of raising piles of money to send our youth on a mission trip 500 or 600 miles away, we have our youth raise money to help pay for those projects that the youth would then be working on with the men's group work crews. So they would learn a skill, painting, plumbing, electrical, and B, you'd have this time of when the youth and the men would be doing something other than church.
We
Back
need
in
to
our,
reclaim the fact that things that you do outside the church can be holy.
yeah, gee, I think Luther said something about that, didn't he? All work is sacred work.
Yes, all work is sacred work. Dorothy Sayers has a lot to say about that.
Well, I think that's one of the things about when Wesley was, you talked about the social holiness thing. It was, if you're supposed to be doing 8 hours of work, do 8 hours of work. if you were handling the money for your company, you don't embezzle a little bit here and a little bit there. And so on, as you know, if you're a teacher, you teach, not indoctrinate. Distinctive. And like I said, when I think it was in Snyder's Radical Wesley, he mentioned the fact that eventually what happened was his businesses would hire Methodists for positions of lower and middle management because they knew they were trustworthy, they knew they were honest, and they knew they were going to do a good job. Well, if that's the case, guess what? That doesn't, like you had said, it impacts your well-being, your economic status, because instead of being the grunt laborers, you're now managing the grunt laborers because they know you're going to be honest and they know you will treat the workers fairly, but expect them to do the job. How do we re-inculcate those kinds of character traits in a society that's, well, whatever? And someone did a study and said 40% of the time that workers in the Pentagon are on the computer, they're looking at porn or conducting personal business. I'm sorry, aren't you supposed to be protecting me from the nasties out there?
One of the things that distorts our church experience is that in order to employ clergy, we have to have a critical mass of people to pony up the money to have a pastor. And so putting seats in the seats and collecting money to have a pastor becomes the mission of the church instead of the church doing church.
Yeah.
And part of that is we've all settled down in station charges instead of riding circuit because it's less work.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we were all out riding circuit, we've allowed ourselves to become all about maintaining positions in a declining industry instead of what should be the organic growth and development of this society in a given location. And that's not been developed because everything has to go into keeping the machine going.
Yeah.
And clergy are necessary. I'm not going to say they're not, but something has gone fundamentally wrong here, and it's become about other things than it should be about.
Yeah.
You've been awful quiet here. You got anything to lay into this discussion with?
Is Rose even there?
I was talking to Keith first,
Yeah.
or Rose.
He's sitting there just looking at us.
I'm here. I just don't have anything to add. It's been a good conversation, though. I've enjoyed listening to you all.
Well, tell you what, we probably ought to wrap this up. Once again, thank you all for making this journey with me. It's been kind of interesting during this pandemic to gives me something to organize my time around. I appreciate that. But let's pray, and let's pray for the church.
Amen.
Lord, we pray for the United Methodist Church in all of its distractions and travails, that you will bring good out of our current situation, make us what we need to be. We pray for you to guide us, because all of us speak with different voices and none of us see what you see, and only you know what we need to strive for. We pray for your church throughout the world, even beyond the Methodist family. For everyone who names the name of Christ, we pray that you will defend them and show them your grace and prosper their work all over the world. And all these things we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Art.
Yes?
Thank you. I said thank you, Art.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll see you around the ranch, as they say at Philmont.
Okay, I'm gonna go log into YouTube and find your channel. It's a.w.collins, right?
I think it's under Art Collins. I'm not sure.
Art Collins, okay. I'll find it. Because
Okay.
when I try to log in on one of my browsers, it still has my granddaughter is logged in, and I don't know her password to get past it to change it. So,
Dale, if you search for elements of orthodoxy, You
Pardon?
will find it easier than looking for art.
Yeah.
Elements of Orthodoxy. Okay.
It will come up, and then there's different letters. I went and watched one yesterday and discovered that I guess I haven't quite made the turn. Anyway, so yes, and then it helps if you know what number it is that you've missed.
Well, what I was planning on is just watching all of them in sequence over
Very
time, but yeah. Oh, if anybody hasn't, if you'd like a good online devotional, J.D. Walt of Seedbed has a Seedbed daily text that he sends out an email. And right now we're entering the wilderness of Sinai.